I find it to be a perfect analogy for the main topic of today's conversation, which is essentially something that is fundamental to the stability of human life, and that is a personal identity. You have to find in life something that you know it is you. We have name. As human beings, we have brought it up to another level, exponential level of complexity, where we are inherently dependent on our personal identities. Now, sometimes we go through something that psychologists call an identity crisis. I am still in the process, and I have been struggling with this for many, many years, and still struggling, trying to figure out who I am, what am I supposed to be doing. Somehow, we can't find any stability and peace in our life until we find that, whatever it is, a family, children, career, some title on the business card. So for me, I ended up with something that says futurism. And it took me a long time to put that on my business card. And when I meet people and I hand them a business card and I say, what does it mean? What does it mean that you're a futurist? What exactly do you want to explore in your life? Well, for one thing, being a futurist means that you are very genuinely concerned with the future of humanity. And once you're there, once you have that concern, once it strikes you that future is not something that just happens to us, it is something that we create. And particularly right now, in this century, we have the possibilities of creating futures of radical extremes. Once you stand on that ground, you enter the field where you start falling into the rabbit hole that is really, really deep and profoundly interesting, but also scary. And this is exactly what this conference today is about. It's not just rainbows and unicorns. We are talking about a subject that is extremely extreme, and that is the possibilities of something going wrong, terribly wrong. So in my presentation, I'm going to introduce you to the possibility of humanity losing its identity. Anthropic identity crisis is a psychological crisis experienced by a collective human psyche in response to emergence or existence of other advanced species which are similar to us and yet unlike us, whose minds cannot be known. Now that line, whose mind cannot be known, I just added it this morning. There's a meaning to that. I'm going to elaborate on that very soon. So I made this presentation to be made in 2 parts. The first part is going to deal with the past and some possible explanations of the genetical factors that are in play when we're talking about that crisis, that identity crisis. The second part is going to deal with the present and some examples of the modern day life where we can see that fear that I'm going to be talking about, which I call fear of other minds. And in the third part, I'm going to give you a general glimpse of the landscapes of the future and how that fear can potentially skew things around. All right, so there's a particular kind of a cuckoo birds that leave their eggs in the nest of other birds to bring them up and take care of them. In biology, it is called brood parasites. It is a very interesting evolutionary adaptation for survival. And what happens is that the host parents, they usually don't take notice that one of their eggs are slightly different. And somehow they don't even notice that the child is very different. But the cuckoo birds usually end up being smarter, larger, tougher, and eventually kick their siblings out of the nest. And they end up being the only child. The prioritized child, it gets all the food, it gets all the treatment and fun and everything, and their parents just happen to be taking care of them. So this is maybe not the perfect analogy for what happened, but you see, we as a species are the only child in our branch. Almost all other species of planet Earth have some kind of genetic siblings. dogs, flies, everybody has some kind of other species in their subfamily, subtree. Humanity, Homo sapiens, are the only one. Now, what happened to this guy? Looks really cute and smiling, but what happened to him is that most likely we extinguished all of them. About a million years ago, we have actually coexisted with other species of Homo, sapiens, not sapiens, but Homos, at least 3 of them. And this guys. Somehow, there's still talks about what exactly happened and why it happened, but somehow they all got extinguished. One of the most logical explanation is that we killed them all. Now, why did we do that? And if you really think about how that process might have happened, you might have a lot of fun doing that, because I think about it often, since my first major was filming. And since then, I have a peculiar daydream pattern. I like to imagine and fantasize about all kinds of different movies that I might shoot one day. And one of them, somehow, in the past few years, is set in the good old days when we and Neanderthals walked on the same planet. I like to think and try to imagine what it would feel like to actually meet other species like us, and yet not like us. That very element of slight difference somehow evokes some strange fear that cannot be explained in simple terms. But here's a possible explanation. When genes mutate, when species branch out, we change the way we look. We might grow a tail, draw it off, drop off wings, or something happens physiologically that's called the phenotype change. So when certain phenotype qualities of species change, and that is the link that is still very controversial, but when certain phenotype qualities of species change, their mind faculties change. But mind and emotional attitudes that we exhibit is not something we see. This is the invisible variables. So, but those invisible variables, they are linked to the visible variables of our phenotype changes. So I'm going to show you some example. The only probably scientific evidence for that link right now. The sun, I think, goes off now. So this is a Russian silver fox experiment. Excuse me. It was performed in 1959 by Dmitry Belayev in the Institute of Histology and Genetics in Novosibirsk in Russia. He was curious to see how we domesticated, how biological animals, what changes to them once they get domesticated. So he took foxes, because we have domesticated dogs and cats, but we did it so long ago that we can't really figure out how it happened or what it happened. So it was interesting to see what would happen if we domesticated an animal and take it out of the wild, something that has never happened before. But he made a very interesting set for this experiment. They were breeding these foxes, and with every generation they were breeding them, they were selecting out of the breed the foxes that will survive. It was a very controversial experiment. The only factor that was selecting them is against aggression. So they were not looking at how they moved, they were not selecting the tails and the size of the ears or anything like that. They were only selecting against aggression towards human beings. So they would take those foxes that are the most kind and nice towards humans, because originally foxes are very vicious and they're very wild, and they would be very aggressive towards humans. So with every generation, they would be selecting foxes that are nice and kind to us. And here's what happened. This is the wild fox. This is how they live in the wild. This is a Russian silver fox, so it's a particular kind of fox. And this is a domesticated fox. So what started happening is that the phenotype qualities somehow started exhibiting some patterns that we see in dogs and cats that are domesticated. Like they started having furs that are more furry, and their tails actually started curling up. They they started having this white pause, and they did not expect that. That was an outcome of the experiment that they didn't really know what to make of. But the point here is that in the genetical complexity, you can't just, everything is intertwined. You can just tweak something here and leave it as it is. It will trigger some reactions of the overall change of species. And whenever you see evolutionary, every time the species branch out, we already have figured it out. That whenever you see a mutation that is visually apparent, we know already, subconsciously, that there's something in the mind, in the attitudes. It might be more aggressive towards you, it might be not understanding towards you. A particular member of the tribe, for instance, once it changes the way it looks, we already know subconsciously that it's not us. Inside, there are hidden variables that are different. And that evokes that fear, the fear of other minds. This is exactly why I'm using the term fear of other minds, not fear of other species. Because the point that I'm making here is that we have genetical encoding to say that if it looks differently, it thinks differently. Just a few more slides of the cute little foxes and the fascinating differences there. Oh, so yeah, the foxes. Here we go. You know, I think that's the future of that's what's going to substitute the funny kittens on the videos, because they are getting domesticated, they're getting really cuter and cuter and cuter. There are these Chihuahua version foxes now. Unfortunately, they're totally illegal in the state of California, and I really want one, so we're going to have to make some law adjustments. All right. Fear of other species is the fear of other minds, in fact. Let me reiterate that. Slight visual changes in species due to genetic differences evoke fear, which had been etched into our genome by natural selection, and its in the core is a safe mechanism against the unpredicted effects of unknown variables in the psychological makeup of other minds. Now this leads us to part number 2. The modern day evidences of this fear and how it affects the world right now. Some examples. So with any fear, we are made in such ways that if we can't face it in the real world, but it's inside, somehow encoded in us, we have to come up with simulations. We have to come up with models. How we're going to play out this fear. This is something that we're dealing on a regular basis, on the individual level, through dreams always. And on the collective level, we create means slashes poem. That's one of the ways. One of the ways how we simulate and act out possible scenarios when we meet those other minds. Something that is like us and yet not like us. Something that we cannot fully explain. Something that acts and thinks differently. Not like us, like human species. Because again, we are the only child. We have never had experience of meeting other species of our kind that would be slightly different. And that is something we're subconsciously tremendously afraid of, and at the same time, very fascinated about. Because our psychological makeup drives us to find simulations. Now, racial tensions, I would argue, is the mild version of the anthropic identity crisis. This is something that psychologically is bizarre because people often exhibit some negative reactions towards other beings just because they look differently, especially when they're not fully psychologically mature, when they're children or teenagers. So racial tensions are probably the only positive, mild version of the example of the anthropic identity crisis we have right now in real life. But it's not real because we're not dealing with real species. Now, cultural obsession with aliens, that's not a version that we're acting out and simulating that model of meeting other minds, meeting other species. But, you know, yeah, they're out there, they're awesome, and what happens is that, I don't know if they're out there, I didn't see that. But we are quite obsessed with that. And when we talk to people about aliens, do you think they exist, do you think they're not? Whether they think they exist or not, the idea the very idea of possibility of their existence evokes that fear, exactly because it is different. It has a different mind. Okay, I took out the title just because I was curious if I show you this slide, how many of you will know what I'm going to just talk about right now? Okay, 1, okay, 2, 3, 4. Who knows the term uncanny valley? Here we go, more? Great. All right, so uncanny valley is a very interesting and fascinating example of that fear, which, in fact, there's no real good explanation for the uncanny valley, and I'm going to get there. So this person, his name is Hiroshi Ishiguro. He is in Japan, in Osaka, in a professor at the university, and he leads one robotics lab where he wants to create androids, which is the copy of himself. So this is the real guy, this is the copy. Oh, the other way around, doesn't it? But you can see, because when you look at something that is so closely resembling a human being, and yet it's not, you can't tell what exactly is different. But what happens is it freaks you out, and you can't explain why. You can't explain what exactly happens. Well, he actually made a android for his daughter, which is funny because she's going to grow and the android's not going to grow. So there's a graph of uncanny valley. Here's what happens. I don't know if I can walk around, but here's what happens. They made an experiment with a bunch of people. They showed them different objects and robots that range down this axis from not looking anything like a human being to getting closer and closer and closer to starting to look like human being. You would have like toys, teddy bears here, and all kinds of things. Then you have humanoid robots. And this is the axis of how people responded, meaning how they liked it, with certain empathy and familiarity with that object or robot. So what happens is that the closer, the more it starts looking anthropomorphically more and more like a human being, people like it more. But then at a certain point when it gets really, really close to being very much like human being, it drops all the way down to the bottom of fear, unexplained fear, something that comes from the depth of our psyche. So we have the zombies and prosthetic hands, and one of the slides I have Michael Jackson. But and uncanny valley has multiple versions of explanations, and everything you've seen up until now in this presentation essentially is one of the models of explaining where the uncanny valley comes from, where that fear comes from. It comes from this genetic information that whenever you see something that slightly changes from being a human, or something changes from being familiar to you, it has some internal variable changes that you are not aware, you cannot see because it's inside the mind. Oh yeah, so this is just a few slides from the uncanny subject when I was researching that. This is not a SFX, this is not a computer graphics, it's a real girl. Her name is Valeria Lukiana, she lives in Russia, she prides herself as being a Russian Barbie. Well, some people when they meet her, they feel really uncanny, and they feel really weird. That's uncanny cat. That's just a strange slide I found when I was researching the uncanny subject. Just to give you an example of what it feels like when you see something that's slightly off from being real. All right, so here I'm going to summarize all the possible models and versions, how we can simulate or play out, act out models when we do meet those other minds. So we have myths, those are mental simulations, it's not a reality. We have metaphysics now, demons, angels. If it is possible, if you go to Astro and you meet something, then it's always on a personal level, so it's we don't ever experience it on a collective scale. Neanderthals, we have extinguished them. Races, we're still fighting. Aliens, we're still waiting. Artificial intelligence is coming. And cyborgs and transhumans, all the modifications of human species and all the branching out of human species is also coming very soon. So these are the two possible ways of how we are going to encounter that fear, encounter the anthropic identity crisis in its full scale. to the third part. We still have time. I'm going to go quickly. So, oh, everything is moved around. Excuse me. So this is Hugo de Garis. He's one of my favorite people right now, a futurist. I believe he still works for this project, China Brain. They're in China. They're trying to build an artificial intelligence, and I think in the future it's going to be China versus Google. But so he wrote the book. He wrote the book Intellect Wars, where he portrays his views on how he thinks the future society is going to be landscape, right? On a political scale. That's what I like about his view, his talks, and his models of the future, is that he doesn't talk just about what's going to happen, but he talks about how politically we're going to stratify ourselves around those events. So he introduces concepts of cosmos and terrans. Here's how he sees the future. So we have three species. Artilects. Artilects is a term that I also adopted, that I use it all the time instead of artificial intelligence. Just artilects. Then we have cyborgs, which is essentially emergence of technology, machines, and humans. And then on the level of humans, he says that we will split into two political fractions. He calls them terrans, from the word terra. I'm not a personal fan of this word, but terra, earth, so those will be the people who will be organics, I call them. They will be against building artificial intelligences. And then he says that it will be cosmists, who are the people who will be for building artificial intelligence. This is, I think, a very interesting beginning for a debate about how political stratum of the future will take its shape. But I think it's not very complete, and I don't think I have enough time to elaborate on the last slide, which has a lot. But this is a spectrum. I'm just going to skip it very quickly. This is a spectrum from pure code to pure human, and different spectrum of what kind of species we're going to have. Now, there's a lot here that I would like to talk about, and this is something that I would love to talk about on the conference that will deal directly with artificial intelligence. Because this is my message, artificial intelligence, and when it's coming. Now, to wrap up the presentation, I would like to say that for those of you who don't know, a week ago, we have actually officially passed the Turing test. Those who don't know what's the Turing test, very quickly, Turing test, Turing, he created a benchmark that we can, as humanity, use to gauge whether a certain piece of code can act like a human being, to convince other humans that it is a human being. Basically, you sit there in a computer lab, you chat with somebody on the screen, you don't know if it's a human or not. You ask questions, you can ask any question you want, you have an actual live conversation, and then you say, oh, I thought that I was just talking to a human, or I thought I was just talking to a computer. So, me personally, and some people in the futures community, we have been expecting and waiting this for a long time. So suddenly we pass the Turing test, and what happens? This is a post from the Facebook wall of Gray Scott. I think he presented here, and many of you probably know him. He's a futurist too. He says, well, get just a step closer to Turing test breakthrough, and everyone bitches that it's not the real thing or good enough. I'll say. I fully agree with Scott, and what I would like to add, my 5 cents, is that I think this is a very good example that shows that people are afraid. Some people in the world, like us, meaning here, like strange offshoots of humanity, we are very excited. We're like, yes, let's build artificial intelligences. They're going to be our friends, and let's modify foxes. But most of people, in fact, will be affected by that internal fear. The fear that comes from the level of the deep genetical psyche that we inherently carry throughout many millennia of our species branch out, which tells us when something is different, you gotta be afraid of it, because there are hidden variables, and you don't know how it thinks, you don't know how it acts. We are inherently afraid of meeting other species that are as intelligent or more intelligent than us. And I think we don't fully understand the depth of that fear and what it might mean for the future health of humanity. But the most important question, and the most scary question that we will have to ask, and we will have to answer, is does it have a mind? This is the end of my presentation. However, I would like it is at the same time the beginning, because this is when it all started for me. On May 10th, I went to see the premiere of movie Transcendence. And that very night, when I came back home, I couldn't sleep. I was just sitting there, like, this is the biggest, most profound question humanity will ever face. It will force us into building the whole new levels of sciences that will have to explain things like consciousness, self-awareness, possibly the existence of soul, and all these things, because we will not be able to coexist with something that half of humanity will consider gods, half of humanity will consider demons, half of humanity will just say it's just a machine, whatever, automaton, doesn't think. Then those automatons will rise and say, we have rights, we have social security, and all those kind of things. So these are essentially, this is the crux of a very important time for humanity. When I came home that night after watching Transcendence, I have registered a domain name, Artilect Uno. You can actually go on Whois database and see that it was registered that day, in anticipation of the very first artificial intelligence. My intent is to launch an online project, which will be, in a sense, a web magazine, reporting everything on the creation of artificial intelligence. But more, I would like to make it more of a platform for collaborative discussion, both for people in academia and science, as well as simple Joe watching sci-fis. I would be honored if some of you, not all, would come to this website, not today, and check it out. And somehow find ways, if you have any articles or any information that you would like to post there, please send it to me as well. Thank you. Now, I totally forgot, but as I'm slowly descending from this stage, I would like you to watch a small little clip that inspired everything that you have seen in this presentation.
One second, it's not playing.
The facility is 5 stories down so that we can control the temperature of the lab.
Welcome. We're glad you're here.